This is going to be a very lightly scripted video in which you listen to my keyboard and probably also my dishwasher in the background. I'd apologize for that, but I'm not sorry. I've got a new high production flyout video coming soon, probably sometime next week. Lord, I thought those took forever before I started writing stories for them, and now they really do. Anyway, we're in Stormworks, right? It's been a while. We're here because they released a sailing update, and I've noticed a lot of people covering it don't really know a whole lot about sailboat rigging, and it doesn't help that Stormworks doesn't, at least at first glance, appear to support conventional bermuda rigs, that being the type of rig that you usually see on a private sailboat in the harbor. Now, I am by no means an expert sailor. I have been doing it for about 2 years. But I am one, and I am at least sufficiently familiar with the Bermuda rig on my Cat 27 to roughly reproduce it in Stormworks, and I'm happy to report that it can pretty much all be done, given a few workarounds. As I am by no means an expert, this video will be specifically on the Bermuda rig. Hell, it'll be specifically on my Bermuda rig. Again, I've only ever really sailed one boat. The big difference between that boat and the example I'm about to show you in terms of rigging is that I've got 120% Genoa on the real one, which I didn't bother to replicate here. I'm not actually sure if that changes the way foresheets get rigged typically, but what we're going to see here is an approximation of the way my foresheet is rigged. Anyway, down to business. I'm going to start with a tour, and we'll do a quick build at the end. So far, most of the videos I've seen on sailboats and Stormworks try to control the booms directly, but this is not how Bermuda rigs work. Instead, the sails, both jib and main, pivot freely, but their travel range is limited by pilot-controlled lines termed sheets. This is in contrast to halyards, which raise and lower the sails. On my boat, there is one main sheet and 2 jib sheets. I think this is typical of Bermuda rigs. The advantage of having 2 jib sheets is it gives you control over which side the jib is on when sailing downwind, and probably some other advantages that I'm not yet aware of. But you can probably skip it if you're looking for an easy, streamlined build. One other note on the rig that I'm demonstrating here, my boat is rigged with a roller reefing Genoa, so I don't have or don't use my jib halyard. Instead, if I want to retract my foresail, I pull it in with a reefing line that's hooked to a spool from the roller reef, and that is roughly the system we're going to approximate here. To start things off, here's a quick diagram pointing out where my winches are and what they're approximating. I'll leave it up for a while, but if you have to pause, then pause and look at it. You could probably reproduce my results just by looking at this image. I know all that 4 jib stuff is probably a little bit confusing with this tiny little arrows on this image, but I promise it'll make more sense when I demonstrate it. Also, I might end up using the term foresail and jib sail a little bit interchangeably here. For our purposes, they're the same sail. There are many types of foresail. One of the types of foresail is a jib sail, and this boat is equipped with a jib sail. Okay, hopefully I can make that diagram a little clearer with a demonstration. I pulled the boat out and killed the wind for now. Let's go on a tour of the winches and the other mechanics. This is the main sheet. It's a single line leading from the deck here to the boom, and as you can see, as long as that line is tight, the boom can move very little. Tightening and loosening this line is how we'll control the angle of the main sail. This is the port jib sheet. And over here is the starboard jib sheet. For the most part, you can think of them as one line, a line that will control the tension of the jib just like the main sheet controls the tension of the boom. The reason we have 2 of them is we might have to do that job of controlling tension on either the port or starboard side of the boat. In real life, you'll typically only control one side foresheet at a time, and the sheet that you're not using is termed the lazy sheet. And that's allowed to pay out more or less freely, while the sheet that you're using controls tension. In Stormworks, we don't have the luxury of just paying a sheet out freely, so we have to manually pay out our lazy sheet by winching out its winch. Just make sure that the lazy sheet is always a little bit looser than the seat that's actually controlling sail tension. Over here, if I can avoid falling in the water, is the jib reefing line. Now, this part is common on Bermuda rigs, but it's not exactly standard. Normally, the jib would be hoisted up the mast on a halyard, just like the mainsail is. This is kind of a pain, though, both in real life and in Stormworks. So what we're instead approximating here is the reefing line on a roller reefing jib. This line pulls the bottom mast-facing corner of the jib, called the clew, forward until it meets the front of the sail, which in Stormworks, with the relax mode on, is good enough to collapse the sail. In real life, this is done by winding the jib sail around a drum mounted on the forestay, a cable connecting the top of the mast to the bow. In our case, we just move the sail points together and hit the relax button, and that does a pretty good job of approximating the behavior of roller reefing. When we want to extend the jib again, we winch the jib sheet on the side of the boat that we want the jib out. So if the wind is coming from this side, we'll want the jib on this side, and we will winch in this sheet, which will pull the jib this direction. And while we're doing that, we'll also pay out the reefing line. And that's more or less the same process as to how that's done in real life. Last but not least, we have the main halyard. In real life, this is a line attached to the top of the mainsail, called the head, that hoists it up the mast along runners. This mechanical track is serving as our runners. If you want to be precise, you could replace the linear mechanism that I'm using with a slider and another winch, and that would be a little bit more realistic, but in my opinion, it isn't quite worth the bulk or complication. Instead, we just drive our linear track up the top of the mast, resulting in the mainsail being raised. I'll demonstrate hoisting and reefing both sails. Now the main, ordinarily you would do this facing into the wind. We've got no wind at the moment, so I'm not going to worry about that. Hoisting the main is very simple. It just goes straight up the mast. And the sail stretches out behind us. Stormworks uses this sail relaxing system, so the sail's exceedingly taut right now. But if I hit space, it'll go slack and behave a bit more the way we would expect. And you can see that also loosened up my jib a little bit. Okay, now, this part is a little bit more complicated. We need to pay out the jib sheet, or the jib. And in order to do that, we need to both release the jib reefing line and pull in one of the jib sheets. So this is my jib sheet control here. I am going to pull in the one on the port side. And as I do that, I am going to pay out the reefing line, which I have bound to the helm at the moment, hence my getting back in. And you can see that that just sort of operates a tug of war that pulls the jib out into place. And now, this is a bit of Stormworks weirdness, but it is pretty important to getting this to work properly. I have had the relax mode on the sails on the whole time, but as you can see, the jib here is free floating. It's just got this block of pieces that fly around. And that's realistic for a Bermuda rig, but we need to make sure that the jib doesn't automatically kind of reef itself, which if the relax mode is on, it will do, which is not realistic, nor is it good. So I have just turned that off. It's also bound to my helm. And now I can release the jib sheet. And I have fully deployed sails. And this would be the way that the boat would be rigged on a close haul. So if you're going just about upwind or mostly upwind, you would be rigged pretty much like this. But if you were going on a beam reach with the wind coming from the side or a broad reach with the wind behind you, you would pay some of these out a little bit so that the sails had room to move and catch more of the wind and be at the angle that you wanted. But before I demonstrate that happening in real time, let's demonstrate reefing these sails again, since it's one of the more complicated things that we can do. So in order to reef, we will need relax mode on again, which I've now turned on. And yeah, I've got it on. We will start by reefing the jib, which is also the order we would generally do it in real life. And that is pretty easy. I just need to begin to hoist it in. That's also bound to the helm. I am now winching in that winch in the front, which is beginning to pull the jib forward, and I also have to give it some slack, so I will release the jib sheet on the port side. And that will effectively collapse our forward sail. And in real life, that sail, what that forward reefing line would be doing is actually spinning a drum that would wrap the sail up around that forestay. This, however, will have to be good enough for our purposes. got a little bit too much tension on my sheets. There we go. And now we can bring down the main. And the main is nice and simple. Let me make sure that I still have relax on. I do. And with that, we can just lower it. And it will helpfully collapse in on itself, which is a lot easier than bundling them up is in real life. And that leaves us with a completely reefed boat catching no wind. Now, before we go on to a build, I'm going to demonstrate actually sailing with this rig. My writing instincts tell me that that would be better to do with the build demonstration version, but unfortunately I haven't got all day, and the developers are right about sails taking some tuning to get right. But this boat works pretty well, so it'll be our test case. But before we can do that, I'll do my due diligence and go over the points of sail real quick. There are a million resources for this kind of information, and I would suggest you seek them instead if you're interested in knowing more, but for now, this is a quick rundown. As the patch notes mention, one of the important things about sailing is that the sails operate both as parachutes and as wings. That wing behavior is what enables some sailboats to reach speeds above that of the wind. And just like with airplane wings, angle of attack is everything. That means we care a lot about sail angle. Let's start with the simplest case, wind coming from behind. For this situation, our sails are parachutes, and we want them to present as much surface area to the wind as possible. So we'll pay out our main and jib sheet all the way, so that the sails are as flat to the wind as possible. This is called running. One interesting note on running is, if we're clever with our jib sheets, we can pick which side we want the jib to be on, and we can put it on the opposite side as the main sail. This is called wing and wing. In real life, this has some nuanced advantages and disadvantages compared to a broad reach that have to do with sails shadowing each other, but this is Stormworks, so for our purposes it just looks cool and maybe helps centralize force vectors acting on the boat. From there, with the wind coming at a little bit of an angle, we move on to a broad reach. Here our sails are still primarily capturing the wind as opposed to generating lift. We just pull them in a bit to keep them perpendicular with the wind. Now, as our boat starts to become perpendicular to the wind, we move on to a beam reach. On a beam reach, our sails shift to acting as wings, and for this reason, you don't haul quite as close as you might think. We're no longer trying to capture as much wind as possible. Instead, we're trying to keep the sail at the highest possible angle of attack without stalling, and thus generating as much lift as we possibly can. It is in this configuration that Bermuda-rigged boats are at their fastest and capable of outrunning the wind. I'm not sure how true this is in Stormworks, but so far I have found that I find my highest speeds on a beam reach. Getting closer to the wind, we move into a close reach and then a close haul. In these positions, we're pulling the sail very close to the boat to try to keep the angle of attack positive and leaning very heavily on lift for forward speed. You can still achieve surprisingly high speeds this way, but the closer you get to the wind, the worse it gets. When you get close enough, the air goes out of the sails and they lose their structure, instead beginning to luff. We are now what is called in irons, and we won't be going anywhere. This region is roughly 45 degrees in size. If we instead build up some momentum and turn all the way through irons without stopping, our sails will snap from one side to the other, and we'll have to trade which jib sheet is the lazy sheet. The boom, however, will come across on its own. This is called tacking, and it's relatively gentle. Still, make sure the boom doesn't knock you into the water to be shark food. Now, the points of sail are the same in the other direction, so we won't get into that. That said, if we were to come all the way about and cross the wind facing downwind, our sails will again snap across the boat as the prevailing wind shifts from one side to the other. This is called a jibe, and since the sails are catching a lot more wind, it's a lot more violent than attack. Really watch the boom on that one. Now, let's do a live demonstration of that exact thing. I'll start off here, running, and configured wing and wing. You can see that the wind is coming roughly off the stern. From here, I'll demonstrate switching the side the jib is on, which we do by tightening our jib sheets to get ready, and then widening, and then winding in the starboard sheet. As you see here, my jib is presently on the port side. So I am going to bring tension on the port side, get the jib close, and also bring in the starboard side sheet, because I'm going to have to haul it over with that. See, that line goes tight. Now, in order to get the jib on the other side, I'm going to need to loosen this side and tighten this side, which is what we'll do now. That brings the jib across. This sucks with a Genoa, by the way, because you have to tear it past the mast. And now the jib is on the side that we want. And this side, which was previously the jib sheet, is now the lazy sheet. Now this is our jib sheet. So since our tension is going to be set with this, we want to have a decent amount of slack on this one. So we'll let that one out a little bit. And we'll also begin letting out our now active jib sheet. And this is now how we're going to control tension. And you can see I've still got a little bit too much tension on my lazy sheet, so I'll let that out a little bit more. And we can control the jib just like that. Now we'll turn off a little. Start heading a bit this way. Not quite on a beam reach, still mostly have a tailwind, so I'm going to pop the heading hold back on. And now our job is to bring the sails almost as perpendicular to the wind direction, as we are still using them predominantly as parachutes. Our jib is actually already at a pretty good angle, but we're going to bring our main in a little bit. A little bit further. You see we're doing about 5 knots. And on our broad reach, we have our sails more or less perpendicular to the wind. But now we're going to move further into a beam reach. Right about here. So now we are on a beam reach. We are going to bring the sails in a little bit, but not as much as you might think. Remember, we're still interested in creating a high angle of attack between the sail and the wind without stalling the sail. We're no longer so worried about having as much wind in the sail as physically possible. So I'm bringing the main just a little bit. You can see my speed go up a touch. And I am also going to bring in the active jib sheet, getting a little bit more speed. And now we have a pretty good angle of attack between, we could bring the jib in a little bit further. There we go, almost up to 5 knots again. You can see we have a pretty good angle of attack between the main sail, the jib sail, and the direction of the wind. And that is generating a lot of lift, moving in the direction of roughly forward for the boat, and our keel is making that direction actually forward for us. In interest of demonstrating sail trim a little bit, see I'm doing almost 5 knots, 4.9. I will play with the trim a little bit, and we'll see what kind of speeds we can get. I'm going to start by bringing in the main sheet a little bit, and see if we can go any faster. Now we've lost speed. So instead, let's pay it out. Back up to 4.9. Let's see if we can get to 5 knots. Give it a little bit more. Ooh, look at that. 4.97, 98, 99. This might be easier than I had thought. Let's give ourselves a little bit more jib. And there's 5 knots. A little bit more. Yeah, look at that. About 5.05 is about what we're going to get, it looks like. And that's the process by which you trim sails. Now let's move further onto a close reach and then a close haul. So now we're sailing partially upwind. We're very reliant on lift here, so we want our sails pulled pretty tight. I'm going to bring the jib sheet almost all the way in, and also the main sheet. Nice and tight. And we're still doing about 3.5 knots. I might be a little too tight. Pay out the main a little bit. Not too loose. Yeah, that's about what we're going to get. I might do a little bit better pulling in the jib. Not making it worse, I'm too tight. As you can see, this gets a bit more challenging as you start to go further and further upwind. Now we're doing just under 3 knots, and that looks like it's about what we're going to get. Now you'll notice that I've got my heading hold on, and my rudder is turned way over. And you'll probably also notice that when sails are pulled this tight, it can take a lot of rudder to hold the direction, as sails and Stormworks really want to apply yaw forces. And that isn't entirely unrealistic. It can be a serious upper body workout in real life, too. Though I do think the force is a little bit overstated here. Of course, it also doesn't help that I'm using these tiny little rudders. Stormworks fluid dynamics is weird. In practice, you can alleviate it by letting the sail sheets out a little bit more if the force is too high. See, I've got my rudder pretty far over, and I'm doing about 2.7 knots. But if I pay these back out, I will suffer some in speed. Of course, I say that, but I had bad trim, so now we're actually going faster. See, this is the fun part of sailing, is this process. Got it almost up to 4 knots doing that. Anyway, the point is, as you do this, you release, you pull some of the force out of the sails. Like, my main actually just went completely into irons. Pull that back before we lose all our speed. And that reduces the amount of force that it takes, and the rudder is now a bit straighter because the sails aren't applying as much torque to the boat. So that's something that you can do in the process, or you can do during sailing. During build, it's a matter of how big your sails are, where exactly you place them, and where exactly you place your keel. Also, how big your rudder is. You're probably going to need it to be bigger than you think. And to give Stormworks some credit, if you look at the size of rudders on sailboats, they're typically pretty enormous. So now we are going to turn through irons and tack. We need to have some decent momentum for that, so it's a good thing I screwed up my trim earlier, and we're now doing almost 6 knots. And we're doing that largely upwind, nearly in irons. So the process here is we're going to use this speed that we have now to turn through irons. The sails are going to luff, and then the boom will come across as the wind changes which side of the boat it's on, and then we'll have to change which sheet is the lazy sheet. Again, the port sheet will have to become the active sheet for the foresail. So we will turn off heading hold and come through. And across comes the boom, and the jib's trying. Keep going, keep going. There we go. Oh, the jib has hung up on the side of the boat, and so I am getting a lot of extra force, which is really trying to turn me to the left. Hoist the jib up and begin to pull it across. And the jib getting stuck on the side of the boat thing, I consider that a feature because honestly I've had that happen in real life plenty. I've got a little clip there, and it gets stuck on some of the stays, or and of course I have a 120% Genoa, it'll get stuck on the mast. Going ahead and physically moving the clue past something is something you could definitely have to do on a real boat, so I've left it on this one. Make sure our lazy sheet's nice and loose. And we've tacked. And we're actually now basically on a beam reach going the other direction. So last but least, we'll demonstrate a jibe. And let me make sure that my mainsail is nice and far out for our run. Let the jib out. Make sure my lazy sheet's got slack. Alright, you could barely see we're moving because our sails are acting purely as parachutes now, and we're going almost exactly the wind speed. So if it weren't for something like that island way out there, it would be almost impossible to tell that we were moving. Which is also an interesting thing that you see happen in real life. Alright, let's tack. And it should be a lot easier than it looks because, though it doesn't look like it, we're doing almost 5 knots. Come on, Maine. Look how fast that is when it happens. That could be a surprise in real life if you aren't ready for it. It could be a surprise here, even. Alright, and it looks like I have gone and gotten my jib clue stuck in the hull, which is something that only started happening today for reasons that are not clear to me. I could have avoided that by tightening my jib sheets before making that maneuver, and I probably should have done that. But that was enough to demonstrate it, so that's good enough for me. I am not re-recording this for that reason. Now, let's rig a sailboat. Fortunately, it happens that I've got a hull that I prepared earlier. Now, unfortunately for you all, I'm afraid this will be the sloppiest part of the video because I can't think of a good way to pre-script it. We're just going to do this. So enjoy my keyboard noises. Let's see, I've got any number of... here we go. So this is one of the hulls that I prepared while being excited about the sailing update happening at some point. And as you can see, I haven't rigged it yet. So it is perfect for our purposes. And my plan here is to rig it pretty much exactly the way the boat that I've been showing is rigged. So the easiest thing to start with is the boom. And before I do that, let's see, yeah, I did put a keel on it. Let's check how high we are going to be because we want to ideally not have ourselves be clipped by the boom all the time. In real life, there are plenty of boats that are rigged in a way that you have to duck the boom, but mine personally isn't like that, and I prefer to avoid it. Fortunately, it looks like we're nice and low, so our boom can probably be way down here. And we will throw in a perfectly idle hinge and extend our boom. And we'll just go to about there. And if you want an idea of how long your boom should be, I just look at PNGs of boats, see what people generally do. I don't really know if there is a mathematic answer that could give you a guess at what an optimal sail size would be. I basically just do it to eye. We might need that mast to be a little bit taller. Also not entirely sure about this keel position. Might move that. It's probably going to have to go a bit forward to line up closer with the mast. We'll see where that gets us. And I don't plan to do an exhaustive trimming guide to deal with things like running, like running on beam reach because it's very time consuming. And my objective here is mostly to demonstrate how to set up the rigging. If you have your rigging and you're looking to trim, then it's really a game of where exactly you put this keel versus where this mast is and how big your rudder is. Those are the biggest things. So just screw with that. So let's see, where do we want to put our main sheet? There are actually a lot of places that the main sheet can go on boats. I have seen it all the way back here. Personally, mine is right here, actually. On this one, let's put it right here, because we have some room here. So we will slap a winch, and the small ones are fine. Right here, which will serve as the main sheet. And we will need a rope anchor point for it to attach to so that we can control how far the boom rotates. Did I ever put any batteries on this? Looks like no. slap a medium one down here so we don't have to think about it. And that goes to that main sheet. And so this will control how far out the sail pivots. We also need to control how far up the sail goes, which means it is time for our halyard. And I'm going to set that up the same way as I did, using a track. And then we will install our sail points. One here. One here. And of course we have to have 4 of them. There are a couple ways that you could go about this. Let me move this up one. So one like the way that the demo boat does it, as I recall, is it places the other sail point here in order to form a triangle. What I don't like about that is you pinning the sail in place, in a place where it might not necessarily be pinned, depending on how your sail is rigged. It actually might be better to do in terms of efficiency, because you're probably losing something sometimes to the sail forming a U shape. I don't know. So far, I have had the most luck doing this, and having both points be at the head. And of course this sail will be starting collapsed, and that's just fine. Let's make sure that this is linked in. And just like that, we have a mainsail. And let's test this rig out a little bit before we get too excited. Gonna need some controls. In interest of expedience, I'm going to just use full buttons. Yeah, we'll use toggle buttons. These winches are kind of slow, so it can be helpful. And that allows you to look up at what the sail is doing while the button's actuating. So this will be hoist and reef. Oh, actually, that takes a value input, so we will use a throttle for this instead. Which goes from -1 to 1. Spice Weasel, bam. And then we would also need our main sheet controls. For those, we will use buttons. Main sheet out, main sheet in. Make sure we have power to all this. Main sheet out, we want to wind this down, which is counterintuitive, but Stormworks assumes that this winch will be facing, downwards. I guess is the idea behind the nomenclature. And up. And let's see, that should be our basic controls. Actually, let's slap a rudder on this real quick. This is going to be an ugly rudder. Forgive me. Can we jam a medium on here? Can we get away with that? Sure. That's going to make it a little bit easier to keep directional control. Cool, good enough for me. That's actually not an unreasonable proportion either. And we need some way of controlling the boat for small designs. I kind of like using the machine gun handle. I'm going to have to move this part of my seat out. Was that important? Yes, it was. Let's see if we can get away with that. Yes. I like using it just because it doesn't take up much space, and in real life, on a boat of this size, you would probably be on the tiller most of the time, and you'd be reaching around the cockpit a lot. I think this is a reasonable compromise. So we will run AD here to the rudder. And actually, in order to save us some suffering, we'll use the glory of modified workbenches is to not deal with the sides of the pier. And you can see our sail is nice and folded. Let's give ourselves a little bit of wind. Let's give ourselves a wind vane so we know what's going on. Yep, we've got a nice following breeze. My rudder sounds good, yes. And let's raise the main halyard. Apparently that's backwards. And up it goes. I've forgotten to bind a key to relax the sail, but this should be good enough to test. Let's let that out. Since we're on perfectly running right now, so we need the sail to be pretty far out in order to make much headway. So we are in pure parachute mode. And we're underway. So that's the mainsail. While we're here and I'm thinking about it, let's bind up the sail relax to trigger, which is what I've been using. I think in my ideal world, I would come up with some way of automating when the sail is or isn't being relaxed, so that the process of sheeting in and out is like as close to, or rather the process of raising or lowering a sail is as close to just doing it as possible, but we'll look at that later. Okay, so I've got that set up, and now the most interesting part, the part that it doesn't immediately seem super supported, is the jib. Because our jib, we don't want to have the clue physically attached to a boom the way it is here. I think there are jib designs that are, but not the standard... not this particular rig, and is what I'm looking to replicate, and it is the more common thing as far as I know. And we are again going to do the roller reefing thing because it's just the easiest way to do this. So I am going to need a winch for reefing, which will go up here at the bowsprit. And actually, let's see, I've put this free-floating block way back by the mast, but that's where it'll be when it's deployed. I actually want it to be up by its reef point so that it starts not deployed. So I will need a rope anchor, which will connect to the reef. Right there. Oh, hello? Oh, it's a sail node. I need a rope node. And this will also need power. So now we have this free-floating block, and this free-floating block is what will serve as the clue of the jib. And to do that, we'll actually install the attachment point for the clue right there. Now, since this is going to be free-floating, it's pretty easy to deal with the rest of the sail anchors. We are going to need one here, where the furthest forward point of the sail, I forget exactly what that's called. We might as well look that up. Attack! So we can plan on connecting that part of the sail there. And then we also care about where it attaches, the furthest part up the mast. We could try to put our 2 points there to make 4. I'm going to do this with 1, which is the same way I did it on the other boat. And I might have to move a couple of things. Maybe not. So this is going to be an awkward square, but it is one, is our folded jib. And it's starting reefed all the way in. Now, the other thing that we're going to need are our jib sheets. And you can see, you could probably get away with using one jib sheet. You wouldn't get control of which side the jib ended up on, but it would probably be fine in most cases. But since I did it on the other one, I'm going to do it here too. You know what? It would actually make more sense if... Well, I don't know if it would make more sense, but it would be easier if we did that here. And you typically don't see things exactly like this on real boats because usually this is done with a pulley system. Like on mine, the jib sheets actually are all the way back here. They go around a pulley here somewhere and you pull them across. But mechanically it's the same. You tension a line in this region. So we will need anchor points for that line. I stacked them vertically on the other boat. You can also do it horizontally. We'll do horizontally here. And we'll throw in some wedges to make that transition a little bit easier. It is unfortunate that the clue has to have this giant thing on it. Like in the real world, there would just be a loop on the sail and all the lines would attach to that. But yeah, no dice here. We can't even attach two winches to one node, so we can't just do it with one. That's frustrating. It's frustrating, but it does work. Okay, so we now need to be able to winch in and winch out our jib sheets. So we'll put those over here. Wire that all up. And of course, we're also going to need some way of controlling our reefing line up there. And we will... we'll put that over here, I guess. And then, so we're not here all day, we're going to turn up the speed on these winches quite a bit. On my other boat, I have this set to 3, or possibly even lower, which gives you a little bit more control, but we would like to not be here all day. Again, the reason why you would want it slow is because it's useful to be able to look at the sails, so you need to have time to not be on the button. I personally recommend 2 or 3, but we're going to do 5 here. We also need to do the main sheet. That one's real slow. And I think we are, in theory, rigged. Let's see what we got. Oh, look at how nice and... Oh, you know what we didn't do is we didn't bind relax on this jib. Let's do that also. Yeah, that looks nice with our pseudo roller reefing, all that. So we still got our following seas. Let's raise the main halyard. This time we will relax it. And that makes a bit more sense. Main sheet out. Much faster now that we've increased the speeds. That gets us underway. We start getting directional control. Now once we're stabilized, we'll work on the jib. Alright, so we are going to need to release the jib and bring both the port and starboard... Well, let's go to wing and wing. I'll have to stay nice and downwind for that. But if I want the jib on the starboard side, then I will bring the starboard jib in. And nothing will happen because I didn't hook up the electrics. Alright, let's try that again. Got that sheet nice and relaxed, moving forward. Now let's actually bring out the jib. So let's bring out, let's do starboard jib in again, and that'll begin to unfurl it. Good, that's what we like to see. We're going to have to actually release the jib so that it's not fighting the reefing line. We'll get hung on the hull, which is good fun. And already we are starting to get somewhere. And now we have to actually turn off the relaxation so that it doesn't get stuck. And now we will actually run the starboard jib, since that's not our lazy sheet, out. And our lazy sheet is nice and loose already. And we're wing and wing. This sail could probably stand to not be quite as tall so it doesn't drag in the water. But there we go. That is a Bermuda rig. Hopefully this video was helpful to you, and I will see you soon in my big high production thrust wing video that is hopefully coming out sometime this week. See you then.